Hey man, sorry to bother. That's okay, it was a bit of a shit take anyway. Okay. Look man, I was wondering if you could do me a favour. I'm about to do the second part of my Nakajima B5N build video, and I was wondering if you could record a couple of background tracks for me. Why can't you just use some music from one of the bands that you already play in? Yeah, about that. So the first part of this video series actually got demonetized because YouTube had automatically detected that I'd used copyrighted material. Wait a second, you used a clip from Uncreation by Elkinwood, didn't you? Yep, Elkinwood, who are an underground atmospheric black metal band? Yep, the same Elkinwood that you play bass and cello in. Yep, so essentially YouTube demonetized your video for using music from a band that you actually play in. That's right. YouTube can be a real pain sometimes. Yeah, I know, right? Anyway, so I need you to record a couple of background tracks for me, just while I run some time-lapse segments in my video. I'm thinking something with a bit of a psychedelic, kind of shoegaze feel to it, but most importantly, something that's not going to get me copyright claimed. Reckon you can do that? Yeah, I should be able to come up with something. Cool. Thanks for that, man. So, now that we've finished the engine, it's time to move on to the cockpit. For me personally, the cockpit is one of the most fun and enjoyable parts of the build. Why is this? Well, there are two main reasons. The first reason is that inside the actual cockpit, you find all sorts of interesting little knobs and levers and dials, and if the kit manufacturer has done a good job, then installing and detailing all these little bits and pieces is very enjoyable. The second reason is that, in my personal opinion, the cockpit is what really brings out the human element of the model. On the actual aircraft, the cockpit is where a living, breathing human being sits and controls the aircraft. When detailing the cockpit, you have to take into consideration exactly how a human would interact with all those little knobs and all those levers, and you find that if done really well, the cockpit can end up being the standout part on a model. Okay, here we have the various cockpit parts. I've done a little bit of cleanup of the parts, but nothing too major. Alright, so what do we have? We have the pilot's instrument panel, the bomb aimer / navigator's instrument panel, and we have this thing here, which includes a radio and a mount for the bomber / navigator's seat. Okay, on this side we've got the pilot's joystick. That contains, as you can see, quite a lot of flash around there. I'm going to have to clear that up. The pilot's seat. Here you've got the bomb aimer's little scope thing that he uses. Again, see this little part there, right there. I'm going to have to chop that off and clean that up a bit. The bomb aimer / navigator seat. I'm not quite sure what this is. There might be another piece of radio equipment. Gonna have to look into that. This is the rear gunner's / radio operator's seat, and I'm pretty sure these are some oxygen bottles. And of course here we have the actual base of the cockpit itself. Alright, now just having a look at some of the parts. Off camera I dry fitted them, and everything seems to fit fairly well. For those of you who don't know, dry fitting basically means you stick the parts together without gluing them just to see what the fit's going to be like. Now, let's have a look at some of the issues that we're going to have with this. See this little bit here? The wall that separates the gunner from the bomb aimer? Well, there is a nice big chunk missing there. We're going to have to fill that in. The other issue is this seat here. There is a big gaping hole in that seat. There you go. And those are going to have to be filled in. Appear to be some little blemishes around here. Not quite sure. There we go. But honestly, I don't think you're going to be able to see those once the cockpit is all sealed up. The real concern is that hole and the hole that's in the pilot's seat. So before we do anything else, let me show you how I'm going to fill those in. This is my preferred product. Tamiya putty, basic type. And to apply it, I use a good old artist's palette knife. So, because the two gaps that we're going to be filling in are quite different, I'm going to show you two different methods that I use to apply putty. We're going to start with the pilot seat because the gap in there is a little bit easier. Now, what we're going to need, of course, is the putty. We're going to need the artist's palette knife. We're going to need a couple of cotton buds, or Q-tips as you Americans call them. And we're also going to need a bottle of nail polish remover. Why do we need nail polish remover? Well, the main ingredient in nail polish remover is acetone, and acetone can be used to thin this type of putty. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use our palette knife to scoop a little bit of putty, and then we're going to apply it right there on the seat, right there. And then what we're going to do is we're going to dip one of these cotton buds in acetone. We can use it to clear off the excess putty in there. What I'm going to do first of all is I'm currently soaking both ends of the Q-tip in the nail polish remover. Now the reason I'm doing that now is because with this putty, even though it takes quite a while to properly set, it actually sort of gets moderately set fairly quickly. So as soon as you apply the putty, the quicker you're able to clean it up with the nail polish remover, the better off it is. So we get just a little bit, because it's not a huge hole that we're cleaning up. That should do nicely. Okay. Okay, it's nicely covered there. And now let's clean some of that out. There we go, it's looking a bit smoother. Okay, that is pretty good for now. Now onto a different method of using putty to fill in gaps. As you can see, the gap that we're trying to fill in here is considerably bigger than the one on the pilot seat. And if we were to try and fill this entire gap with putty, what would probably end up happening is you wouldn't be able to get the putty to fill the entire base of the hole there. You'd probably end up getting an air cavity, and because dried putty is not exactly the most structurally sound of all building materials, it would probably crack and bits would fall out. So what we're going to do to minimize the amount of putty that we have to put in there is, first of all, we're going to fill up most of the hole with a different material, a much cheaper and much more solid material, which is super glue. Right. There we go. Yep. Just let that settle in there nicely. Okay, most of that gap has been filled with super glue now. And now it's time to add the putty in. So what we'll do is we'll put a fairly liberal amount of putty in that gap. Now you want to put it in there quite well, so you try and get as few gaps as possible. Now keep in mind that I may have to go over it a second time. It's a very common thing when applying putty like this. Okay, so for now, we'll leave it like that, and eventually we'll sand it back and see what it looks like. As I somewhat predicted, there's still a little bit of a hole right there. So guess what? We're doing it again. Right, these parts are looking a little bit different than last time you saw them laid out like this. The most obvious difference is that I've sprayed everything with a coat of black primer. Why did I use black specifically? Well, I'll explain that shortly. The joystick and the bomb aiming device, I cleaned those up in much the same way that I cleaned up the engine components in the previous video. And I've also chopped off a bit of the extra plastic and flash that was on those parts. This panel here still has some minor imperfections on it, but honestly, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I mean, the big chunk that was in there previously, that's pretty much disappeared, and in 72 scale, and considering the fact that the cockpit's going to be sealed up, I don't think you're going to notice that little blemish there. Now, with the pilot's seat, I said earlier that after I applied the putty and nail polish remover, I was going to go over it with some sandpaper just to clean it up a little bit more. Well, I decided not to do that. Instead, I elected to go over it a second time with the putty and nail polish remover, and honestly, it looked pretty decent. With this seat here, what I decided to do is to use a small file to try and carve down the ejector pin mark a little bit. Now, as for both seats, the bases of the seat aren't perfect, but honestly, I don't think you're going to see that after I apply some homemade seatbelts. How am I going to make those seatbelts? Well, again, I'll show you that later. Okay, what paints do Hasegawa want you to use exactly? Well, as you can see, quite a few different types of paint here. They want yellow for the oxygen bottles, they want red-brown for the seat here, they want some matte black for the bomb aiming device and a few other components, but as for the majority of the cockpit, they want you to use A. Now what is A exactly? Oh god, no. Oh god, they actually want you to mix a whole bunch of paints in like weird percentages. Yeah, nah, fuck that. We're gonna use this instead. Now, as to why I used black primer for the cockpit, the reason we use black primer is because I'm going to use that to create the illusion of shadows inside the cockpit. And how we're going to do that is with our airbrush, we're going to make sure that we always spray on a downward angle. Now, we don't necessarily have to be exactly 90 degrees along like that, otherwise, obviously you wouldn't be able to get all those little parts inside there in the cockpit. However, providing we keep our airbrush somewhere on these angles, it means that the very bottom of these little parts there is not going to be touched by the paint, thus creating the illusion of a shadow. Before we continue, just want to say that a couple of days ago I had band practice, and at that band practice I gave screaming a go. Well, look what that did for my voice. So I apologise in advance for how my voice is going to sound in this section. Anyway, as you can see, cockpit parts are now all painted. However, just because they're painted in their correct colours doesn't mean that they're finished. We still have quite a bit of work to do before the cockpit is ready to be put together. The next step is to bring out the depth of all these 3D objects. Now, there are two ways that we're going to bring out that depth. The first way is we're going to highlight the raised details. And we're going to do this by painting the raised details in a slightly lighter shade of the base color. We're going to do that by a method called dry brushing. So let me explain what dry brushing is exactly. First of all, you need to take a flat brush, dip it in some paint, and then rub about 90% of that paint off onto a cloth. We're going to start with the black components because black is a fairly easy paint to do this with. When you're trying to bring out the raised surfaces on black objects, all you need to do is just use a medium to dark grey. Then, once you've got your brush, the key is just to add the layers very, very slowly onto those raised details. The reason that I started dry brushing the black components is that it's very easy to find a lighter shade, as there's practically an infinite number of grey paints on the market for you to choose from. However, this is not the case when you're dry brushing over colours that aren't on the white, grey, black spectrum. In order to make a lighter shade of base colours such as cockpit green, you can take a small amount of paint and mix in a touch of white. Making sure, of course, that the white paint you use is the same brand as the base colour. And you can repeat this with other colours as well. Remember a few minutes ago when I said that there are two ways to bring out the depth of these 3D objects? Well, it's time to move on to the second way. And the second way is actually something that we covered in the previous episode where I put together the engine. And that is to use a wash. There are, however, a couple of cockpit parts that won't be receiving the wash treatment. For example, the joystick, the bomb aiming device, and the rear seat. Now, the reason we won't be applying a wash to those parts is because they lack the recessed detail which will really allow the wash to be effective. As you also may remember if you've watched the previous episode, before we can add the wash, we need to spray everything with some of this. The way that we're going to apply a wash to the cockpit is going to be very similar to what we did in the previous video when we put together the engine. We're still going to be using the Vallejo dark grey wash, and we're also still going to be spraying all the components with a fine mist of water. One thing we will be doing a little bit differently though, is we're going to be using a much smaller brush. And any excess wash you can clean up with a flat brush. Okay, while I'm doing this part, there's something in the previous video that I'd like to bring up, and that is my pronunciation of the word Vallejo. I pronounced it in that video Vallejo, and I found out later on that's actually a mistake. The reason why I pronounced it Vallejo is because there's a very good model building YouTuber who goes by the name of Owen, and he runs a channel called Quick Kits. Now, I have a huge amount of respect for him. He builds much better models than I do, and he's able to build these models without using an airbrush. Everything he does on there, he uses a paintbrush. When he does actually use Vallejo products, he pronounces it Vallejo. The reason why I pronounced Vallejo the way he does is because he lives in the UK, I live in Australia, and because he's in closer proximity to Spain, I just kind of assumed that he was pronouncing it correctly. Well, I spoke to a couple of friends of mine, I even checked Wikipedia, because as we all know, Wikipedia is absolutely infallible, and turns out the correct pronunciation is Vallejo. So that is why I used a very strange pronunciation in the previous video. Now that the cockpit parts have been dry brushed and washed, the three-dimensional depth is a little more apparent. However, it still looks like something that just rolled off the Nakajima production line, and not enough like something that has seen combat. When flying in combat, aircraft often suffer from paint peeling and being chipped away from the metal surfaces, and this was especially true of Japanese aircraft during the Second World War. To simulate this effect in the cockpit, we're going to apply some metallic paint over the existing cockpit paint. However, before we do this, we need to figure out exactly where to apply the paint chipping. Remember at the beginning of the video when I talked about adding the human element to the model? Paint chipping inside the cockpit is a good example of this. The paint inside the cockpit is usually worn away by coming into contact with the crew members' boots and to a lesser degree their hands and gloves. So, looking at the instructions, we can guess roughly where the crew members' boots would be resting while the aircraft is in flight. Now for the paint chipping itself. To do this, we'll need 4 items. Some masking tape to act as a paint palette, a bottle of Vallejo acrylic aluminium paint, a small piece of sponge, and a toothpick. First of all, add a little bit of paint to the masking tape. Then, you take the piece of sponge, dip it in the paint, and wipe some of the excess away. Then, using the sponge, gently dab on the areas where you want to simulate the paint chipping. Once you've done the larger areas, smaller bits of chipping can be applied using the toothpick. And now, to complete the worn look, we're going to spray all the parts with a coat of flat, clear, just to give the impression of being a little bit dirty. Now, the thing you've got to keep in mind about clear, flat paint is you don't want to make it too thick, otherwise it can create an unwanted frosty effect. So if you just quickly spray over it like that, leave it dry for a couple of minutes, and then come back to it, and that will prevent that frosting effect from happening. See these circles here? These circles are meant to represent dials. However, at the moment, they don't really look very much like dials, and that's because the sheen of black is uniform across the entire surface. What we're going to do to alleviate that is we're going to very, very carefully paint some clear gloss paint to give the impression of glass-covered dials. And of course, we're not going to forget the reticle on the bomb sight. Unlike the dials that are on the instrument panel, these dials here are on a background of cockpit green. So what we're going to do to bring out the glass effect on those dials is we're going to paint them gloss black. Okay, this video has already gone for a lot longer than I initially anticipated, but I promise we're almost at the end. There's just one more thing to show you before we glue the cockpit parts together. Earlier on in this video, I said that we were going to cover up the not so great seat bottoms with seatbelts. Now, if you're willing to part with a bit of money, the most realistic way to add seatbelts is to buy a photo etch set. For example, Eduard makes a 1:72 scale set of seatbelts for Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, which would suit this kit perfectly. Now, in my experience, photo etch sets can be a bit of a pain to use, but while I'm not averse to using them, I think I'll leave that for another video. For now, I'm going to show you a more budget-friendly and I guess lo-fi option, and that's making your own set. To make your own set, you'll need some linen or canvas coloured paint, in which case we're going to be using sail colour, a steel ruler, a small blade, a flat brush, a set of tweezers, some super glue, and a scrap of newspaper. We're using newspaper because the coarseness of the paper works well to represent seatbelt fabric, especially at this small scale. First off, we paint a small section of the newspaper. Once the paint's dry, you can then go ahead and paint the other side. Now, if you can still see brush strokes and the paint comes out as a little bit irregular, it doesn't really matter that much because that'll just add to the illusion of it being fabric. Now, using a steel ruler and a small blade, cut some very thin strips. And in this scale, try not to make them much more than 1mm thick. And for a cleaner cut, just lightly run your blade down the length of the paper a couple of times. Right, here's the tricky part, and that is determining exactly how long the little strips of paper should be that we just cut out. Japanese military aircraft during the Second World War usually had two straps that went across the base of the seat there, across the pilot's lap, and then one strap that came in from behind the seat like that. If you look at photographs of aircraft seats from the era, you'll find that the base of the strap that goes across the back of the seat usually sits towards the back of the base of the seat, around about there. Now, I did some measurements, and I think if we cut one of the straps to be about 9mm long, that should give us enough distance to glue it to the back and have it down across like that. As for the straps that go across the base of the seat like that, I think about 4mm should do the trick. Now that we have our 9mm and 4mm strips, what we're going to do is take this 9mm strip, apply a tiny amount of super glue to the very end of it, and then fix that end to the very top of the back of the seat, just off on the left-hand side. Then we're going to do something very similar with the shorter strips, but we're going to attach them to the sides of the seat. Once the super glue has had plenty of time to dry, I'd give it about 24 hours personally, then add a very thin layer on the inside of those straps there. And make sure it is a very, very thin layer. And then using a pair of tweezers, just push it down nicely so that it's flush with the seat like that. You just push it down like that. Now, when it comes to the angle of those lap belts there, it's actually a good idea to glue them at kind of random angles like that. Try and make sure they're not perfectly lined up. And the reason for that, well, that comes back to this whole kind of human element of the model. When you think about it, when a pilot gets out of the seat, he's probably just going to haphazardly drop those belts on top of the seat, not put them down in an orderly fashion. So if you mix the angle up a little bit, just makes the whole thing feel a little bit more natural. Still on the topic of the human element, with this seat, I did something a little bit different. I put one belt actually on the seat there, and the other I glued to the side. And the reason I did that is because that's supposed to give the impression that after getting out of the seat, this crew member has just dropped the seat belt to the side of the seat, and that'll be resting on the floor once I glue all the pieces together. As for this seat here, I'm going to leave the belts until I've actually assembled the whole cockpit, just because this one's going to be a little bit more tricky. If you want to earn a few extra bonus points by taking your seatbelts just that little bit further, you can add some seatbelt buckles. Now, in order to do this, you're going to need a very small paintbrush, and you're going to need some sort of chrome metallic paint. Depending on which belt you're going to be adding the buckles to, there are either 2 or 3 areas where you need to paint just a little section of the chrome metallic paint. First of all, you're going to want to paint that little section there, which will represent the clasp that holds the belt onto the seat. Secondly, you're going to want to paint the tips of the belts there to represent the actual belt buckles. Now for this strap at the back of the seat here, there is also a third part that you're going to want to paint, and that's anywhere along there really. And you're going to want to paint a very thin strip of chrome metallic paint. Now that is going to represent the little clasp, or whatever you want to call it, which allows you to adjust the length of that strap. So to do that, you just want a tiny little strip. Just like that. All right, it has been a very long time. It's taken a lot of work, but finally, at long last, all these parts are ready to be glued together. Now, the instructions don't really give a particular order for gluing all the pieces together, so what I think I'll do is I'll start from the front and work my way backwards. Given how much paint has built up in those little crevices there, I don't think poly cement is going to be particularly effective. So what I'll do instead is I will fix the instrument panel on with some super glue. The joystick, on the other hand, has a bit of exposed plastic on the bottom of it. So what I'll do is I'll stick it in to its hole, which is the one most on the left, and then I'll run some glue underneath there. Just like that. And I'll do the same thing for the pilot's seat. With this panel here, given how much plastic there is that can come into contact, I think I'll scrape a bit of paint away and use some regular hobby cement. We just have to be very careful that we don't knock off the seat or anything else that we've glued on. There, that sits quite nicely. Okay, bomb sight's now fixed. Except I'll just fix that angle up a little bit. Oh, look, we've had a little bit of glue spillage there, but hopefully that won't be too much of a problem. I will scrape away the paint on those bits there, because that is how the middle seat is going to get glued on. This one's a little bit tricky. It's maybe one of those ones where I have to hold into position for a while the glue sets. Well, that was a bit of a pain to get on. So now we just have to very delicately attach this whole thing to the cockpit base. Well, look at that. Yeah, I might just have to hold that in place for a little bit. That's another section that I think I'll use super glue on, just because scraping the paint off there is going to be pretty difficult without knocking this thing off. Now here's a slight problem. The instructions don't actually tell you where, on what angle this thing should go on. Oh well, I'm just going to put it sideways and hope for the best. Yeah, that didn't turn out too badly. The oxygen bottles now have a tiny amount of super glue on them. there. That's not too bad. That's not looking too bad, except now that we're really zoomed in, you can see that I overpainted a little bit too much on those metallic bits. Well. Remember at the beginning of the video when I was doing the parts breakdown and I said that this thing might have been a radio of some sort? Well, I did a bit of research and that is incorrect. This, in fact, it's a bit hard to see at this angle, but this is meant to represent a container for where the magazines go for the Type 92 machine gun, which we'll glue onto the aircraft at a later stage. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite fit, so we're going to have to carve down that tab a little bit at the bottom there. There, that's better. Now we just fix this angle up a little bit. Hopefully that'll set. Nope, the glue failed to make contact from the underside, so we're going to have to use some super glue. That seems to be a bit better. As I promised I'd do earlier, I'm now going to add the seatbelts to this rear seat here. We're also going to attach a belt here, just hanging off to the side. Now just push that down over there. And now for the buckles and fasteners. Guess what? It's finally done. Okay, time for a debrief on this cockpit now. Overall, I think it's a pretty good effort. In fact, I'd say it's probably one of the better cockpits that I've built throughout my modeling career. That being said, it is definitely not perfect. But then again, is there really such thing as a perfect model? There are of course some things that I could have done better, and some things that I think Hasegawa could have done better. Let's start off with the things that I think I could have done better. I'd say the wash. I probably could have maybe gone a little bit lighter on there. You can see there's some slight pooling marks around there. I mean, it's only if you look closely, but nonetheless, that's something I could have improved on a bit. Another area where I think I could have done a bit better is on the dials. See, with the dials, I think if I wanted to make them stand out a little bit more, maybe I could have done some dry brushing, like with some white or some silver or something like that. But I didn't want to risk it in case I damaged the black background. Another slight mistake I made, as I think I mentioned earlier, was a little bit of silver got lost in the gap there between the oxygen bottles, but it's not the biggest problem in the world. I think the biggest problem I had with this cockpit was exactly where I'd put the silver paint chipping. Now, as you can see, well, I think I did all right there on the rudder pedals there for the pilot, but I completely missed the mark there, and to a lesser degree there. I mean, in my defense, the instructions were a little bit vague, and I thought the seat was going to be more over this side, hence why I did the paint chipping there. But even then, it wouldn't have been entirely accurate. So yeah, I completely missed the mark there, and I'm not quite sure if the gunner's feet would have stuck out that far whilst in flight. But anyway, it's there. Now for the parts where I think Hasegawa could have done a better job, and the blaringly obvious one is this section here, and the fact that I had to fill in that massive gap there. In fact, if you look closely, you can still see a little bit of a crevice in there. What baffles me is why they didn't just mold the panel itself and then the radio as a separate part which you could glue on. I mean, when you have a look at how well they've done the oxygen bottles there, that's got, you know, weird curves and stuff. It would have been much, much easier just to build or I should say mold, the radio as a separate piece. I mean, that's just all squares and rectangles. So why couldn't they have just molded that separately and then you have it glued on? It's yeah, not quite sure about that. The other thing that I'm not entirely certain about is the historical accuracy of this rear seat here. As you can see, it's meant to depict just basically a leather stool, but I have my doubts as to how accurate that setup is. I mean, granted, finding primary sources on Japanese aircraft in World War II can be a bit difficult for reasons that I won't go into here. But for example, if you look at the newer 1:72 scale kit by Airfix of this aeroplane, they actually have a complete seat, which is detailed there. Interestingly, if you also look at Hasegawa's 1:48 scale rendition of this aircraft, you'll see that the back seat does look quite a bit different. But, you know, whatever. It is what it is, and I'm pretty happy with how my rendition of that leather stool turned out. So there you go. Those are my views on Hasegawa's cockpit for the Nakajima B5N.